The rain had been steady all morning, a thin mist clinging to the windows as I pulled out of the hospital parking lot. My shift at the pharmacy had been long, and I was already exhausted before the accident even happened. One moment, the road stretched ahead with nothing but slick pavement and blurred taillights, and the next, the violent crash of metal and glass swallowed everything. The truck slammed into my car's side, spinning me into the barrier with a force that left my body twisted in angles that didn't make sense. Pain blossomed in my shoulder and head, each second longer than the last, as I sat trapped, dazed and terrified. Before I continue narrating the story of Hannah, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. The paramedics worked quickly, their voices calm but firm as they cut me out of the wreckage. Someone kept telling me not to move, not to fight against the collar strapped around my neck. I wanted to tell them I worked here, that I knew the protocol, but all I could do was whisper the name of my husband, Tyler. They nodded, promising to call him, to let him know where I was being taken. My eyes fluttered closed as the sirens wailed, carrying me back toward the hospital I had just left. When I woke in the emergency room, my arm was strapped and immobilized, a nurse adjusting the monitor by my bed. My phone was in my hand, cracked but still working, and the weight of expectation pushed me to open it. I typed a message to Tyler with shaking fingers, telling him about the accident and begging him to come. Seconds later, 3 dots appeared, the promise of a reply. But when his message arrived, the words pierced me deeper than the broken glass had. Can't leave lunch with Charlotte right now. Her ex is stalking her. Call an Uber. Sorry, babe. I read it once, then again, the words blurring, until the screen became nothing but fractured light. The nurses asked if I had someone else to call, their voices soft, practiced, but I shook my head. It had always been Tyler. He was supposed to be the one, the person who showed up when no one else could. I whispered, "Okay," back to the screen, though there was no one to hear me. That single word carried the weight of our marriage. 8 years of breakfast made, shirts ironed, and promises kept on my side alone. I thought of the mornings he wore the burgundy tie Charlotte once complimented, a tie I had given him years before. I thought of the long lunches he spent with her every Thursday, while I worked double shifts and came home to find him asleep before I even walked through the door. Now he'd chosen her again, even as I lay strapped to a hospital bed with blood drying in my hair. The officer, who had accompanied the paramedics, approached my bedside, her expression unreadable, but kind. She had tried Tyler's number 3 times, each call rolling into voicemail. "Is there someone else you'd like me to contact?" she asked. My throat tightened around the truth, but I forced the words out anyway. "He's at the Sterling Room on 5th Street, table by the window with Charlotte Thomas. Maybe you can tell him in person." The officer studied me for a moment, understanding passing between us without explanation. She nodded and left, and I imagined the scene unfolding in that pristine restaurant. Tyler leaning forward, Charlotte's manicured hand brushing his sleeve. The world narrowed to just the 2 of them. Then the doors would open, officers walking past hushed tables and clinking glasses to deliver the news. For once, Tyler wouldn't be able to pretend he hadn't received the message. I stared at the ceiling tiles above me, each one stained with years of fluorescent light as the minutes ticked by. Memories slipped in and out, our wedding vows, his mother's sharp assessment that I was good for him, the endless cycle of Charlotte's crises. The irony was bitter in my mouth. Charlotte's imaginary emergencies had always mattered more than mine, until now, when mine had become too real to ignore. The pain medication dulled my body, but it couldn't touch the ache in my chest. Betrayal throbbed harder than any wound. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the thin hospital blanket. Tyler's name lit the fractured screen, 3 messages tumbling in quick succession. "I'm so sorry." "Didn't realize it was that serious. Why would you send the police?" That was unnecessary. I let the phone slip from my hand, the words stinging in a way that told me this wasn't just about today. It had been building for years. The nurse returned with a clipboard and gentle instructions, her voice slipping through the fog of painkillers like a thread I couldn't quite grab. She told me I would need to stay overnight for observation. Concussion, possible internal bruising, and the dislocated shoulder needed rest. I nodded, barely processing anything beyond the last words on my phone. Tyler hadn't asked if I was okay. He hadn't even asked what had happened. He only cared that I'd embarrassed him by sending the police to his precious Thursday lunch. Charlotte must have played the part perfectly, shocked, concerned, probably clutching her pearls, while secretly pleased that I'd finally crossed a line. She'd never needed to win Tyler over. She only needed to make me look unreasonable enough to lose him. It was easier for Tyler to believe I was overreacting than to admit he'd failed when it mattered. And now, the whole restaurant knew he had. I imagined the eyes on him as the officer explained the situation. People pausing their meals, turning in their seats, watching his expression shift. I wondered if Charlotte reached for his hand to comfort him, or if she shrank back, preserving her image. That moment must have felt like an ambush, but it wasn't. It was simply reality finally catching up to the fantasy they'd been living behind white tablecloths and lunchtime laughter. He hadn't left the restaurant to come to me. He'd simply turned off his phone. David arrived an hour later, breathless and pale, his rain-soaked jacket sticking to his frame like a second skin. "What the hell happened?" he asked, eyes scanning my bruised face and bandaged shoulder. I didn't answer right away, too numb to decide where the story even started. He sank into the chair beside my bed, gripping the railing like it could steady his anger. "Tyler didn't come?" "No," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of silence. "He was with Charlotte. Lunch was more important." David didn't speak for a moment, his jaw working through clenched teeth, the fury rolling off him in waves. My little brother had always been the calm one, the fixer in every crisis. But now, he looked ready to break something. "You are not going home to that house," he said finally. "I don't know what I'm doing yet," I whispered, though the decision had started forming the moment I saw Tyler's message. It wasn't just this one betrayal. It was the accumulation, the slow erosion of value in our relationship. I had become background noise in my own marriage, while Charlotte was front and center. David sat back in the chair, folding his arms tightly across his chest. "Then you're coming to my place until you figure it out." The doctor returned to check my vitals and examine the dressing on my shoulder, speaking in clipped, tired sentences. He said I'd been lucky, that the truck could have crushed me completely if the impact angle had been different. Lucky wasn't the word I'd use. Surviving while your husband ignores your trauma to eat salmon with his female friend doesn't feel like luck. It feels like a wake-up call. I drifted in and out of sleep, the pain dulling but never quite fading. The rhythmic beeping of machines acting like lullabies. Each time I opened my eyes, David was there, scrolling his phone or watching me with a steady, unreadable gaze. It wasn't until 2 a.m. that I finally asked him to read the messages. He hesitated, like maybe he already had, then accepted my phone and scrolled in silence. The longer he read, the tighter his grip on the phone became. "He told you to call an Uber," David said, voice flat, as if confirming a crime scene detail. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "You could have died." And he said, "Sorry, babe." My brother stood up and started pacing the room, the muscles in his jaw twitching with every step. "This is over, right?" "I don't know," I answered, but the lie rang hollow in the sterile room. We both knew what the answer would be. Maybe I'd said, "I don't know," to buy myself time, or maybe I wasn't ready to admit that it was already over. But David didn't argue. He just sat back down, this time closer, and said, "When you're ready, I'll help with everything." By morning, my discharge papers were ready, and my shoulder was supported in a sling. The hospital offered a car service, but David waved them off and helped me into his car himself. My bag sat in my lap like something foreign, a thing that belonged to another woman with a different kind of life. I stared out the window at the city I'd lived in for years, but it felt unfamiliar now. Everything had shifted. Back at David's apartment, he set me up in the guest room and placed a bottle of water and some crackers on the nightstand. "You're going to need rest before you deal with him," he said, tugging the curtains shut. I nodded, my body still too sore to argue. "You think he'll come here?" David shrugged, his face unreadable. "Only if he thinks he still has a chance." I slept through most of Saturday, waking only when David nudged me gently to drink water or take pain medication. The pain in my shoulder pulsed with each heartbeat, a reminder that rest wouldn't come easy. Tyler didn't text again that day, and the silence felt louder than any apology could have. I stared at my phone more than once, expecting something, anything, but nothing came. Charlotte hadn't reached out either, though I wasn't sure if that was better or worse. By Sunday morning, the quiet in David's apartment was a comfort instead of a weight. He made scrambled eggs and toast, placing the plate in front of me without comment. "You eating for strength," he said as he poured orange juice into a chipped glass from his college years. "We're getting your things today, if you're ready." I stared at the toast for a long moment, then nodded. David had always been patient, but there was steel behind his calm. He didn't push me to talk, didn't ask for a play-by-play of what happened in the restaurant after the police showed up. I didn't know what Tyler looked like when the officers said, "Your wife's in the hospital," and maybe I didn't want to. What mattered was that he stayed seated. What mattered was that he turned off his phone. We pulled up to the townhouse at noon, the driveway still wet from last night's rain. My stomach twisted as we stepped inside, the scent of Tyler's cologne still lingering like a ghost in the hallway. Everything was just as I'd left it. My coffee mug still on the drying rack, my shoes by the front door. The familiarity was cruel, like the house hadn't gotten the message that things had changed. David walked ahead, saying nothing, giving me space. I moved slowly through each room, collecting pieces of myself from shelves and drawers. The cardigan I always wore after work, the half-finished novel on my nightstand, the lotion that smelled like lavender and comfort. These things didn't feel like much, but together, they were my life, carved in between Tyler's needs and Charlotte's crises. I filled 3 boxes before I sat down on the edge of the bed, suddenly too tired to move. David returned with a duffel bag full of my clothes from the closet, carefully folded like he knew how much I hated wrinkles. "You sure about the rest?" he asked, gesturing toward Tyler's side of the room. "Yeah," I said, my voice quiet but certain. "He can keep the emptiness." David looked at me for a long time before nodding once and zipping the bag. We were halfway down the stairs when the front door opened and Tyler stepped inside. His hair was a mess, and he looked like he hadn't shaved in days, something I had only ever seen when he was sick. He froze when he saw me, like he hadn't really believed I would show up. His eyes went straight to the sling on my arm, then to David, who stepped closer instantly. "Hannah," Tyler said, his voice hoarse. "Don't," I whispered, my grip tightening on the railing. Tyler took a step forward, but David moved between us without hesitation. "You're done talking to her unless it's through a lawyer," David said, voice low but firm. Tyler blinked like he couldn't process the rules had changed. "She's my wife," he said, like that was supposed to grant him automatic forgiveness. "Not anymore," I replied, and the air between us seemed to freeze. He looked at me then, really looked, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of regret. "You sent the cops," he said, as though that was the crime. "Because you turned your phone off while I was bleeding," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "You chose fine dining over a hospital bed." "I didn't know it was that bad," he muttered, eyes dropping to the floor. "Then you should have come to see for yourself," David snapped. Tyler's mouth opened, then closed, as if he had no defense that wouldn't make him look worse. "I was trying to help Charlotte. She's been unstable." He said it like I hadn't heard that excuse 1,000 times. "Was she unstable when she was rubbing your arm at the Sterling room?" I asked. And he flinched. "She needed me," he said, but the words rang hollow now, thinner than tissue paper soaked in lies. "And I didn't?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, feeling the heat rise behind my eyes. "I nearly died, Tyler. You weren't there because her ex sent her a creepy text." David placed a hand on my shoulder gently, grounding me before I said more than I needed to. Tyler stood frozen on the stairs, caught between explanation and realization, like he wasn't sure which mask to wear now. "I'll send someone for the rest of my things," I said, stepping around him without another glance. "They can coordinate with David." His mouth opened again, but nothing came out. Outside, the sky had turned soft and gray, the kind of weather that matched my mood. We packed the boxes into David's car in silence, save for the sound of tape and shifting cardboard. I glanced back at the house once before getting into the passenger seat, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It was just a place that happened to contain 8 years of my mistakes. When we drove away, I didn't look back again. David didn't speak much during the drive back, and I was grateful for the silence. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the emergency brake like he needed something to ground him. Every few minutes, he glanced over at me, checking without asking, just making sure I was still breathing. I stared out the window, watching the world blur into muted shapes and wet reflections, trying to ignore the pain in my shoulder and the deeper ache under it. Leaving the house felt like pulling a splinter from my skin, necessary but still bleeding. Back at David's apartment, he helped me carry my things up the stairs and into the spare room. I'd brought so little, just the essentials, just the pieces of myself I still wanted to keep. There was something freeing in that, like shedding dead weight without realizing how heavy it had become. He laid the last box down by the closet and stood there a moment, rubbing the back of his neck. "You want me to say something angry or supportive?" he asked finally. "Neither," I said, managing a weak smile. "Just sit with me." He pulled over the old reading chair from the corner, sinking into it like he belonged there. "Okay," he said simply, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. The next morning, I woke to the sound of David making coffee and muttering to himself about insurance adjusters and contractors. He'd taken a personal day from work, which I hadn't asked for but wasn't surprised by. My brother had always been the kind who didn't wait for permission to show up. I sat at the small kitchen table in one of his oversized hoodies, sipping slowly from a chipped mug that had a cartoon giraffe on it. It was oddly comforting, more than anything Tyler had given me in months. My phone buzzed, and I flinched instinctively, already dreading the name that might flash across the screen. But it wasn't Tyler. It was Charlotte. Her message was longer than expected, and I stared at it for a full minute before even opening it. "Hannah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were actually hurt." Tyler said it wasn't serious. Said you just wanted attention. David looked over, eyebrows raised. "Who's that?" he asked, setting his coffee down. I handed him the phone without a word and watched his face as he read. His mouth tightened, and he blinked a few times, like the words were more offensive than he expected. "She thinks this clears her name," he muttered. "Like realizing 2 days later makes up for anything?" "It doesn't change what happened," I said, the numbness in my voice betraying how hollow I felt. "But at least now I know what he said when I wasn't in the room." David slid the phone back across the table, shaking his head. "You weren't even conscious yet, and he was already rewriting the story." I picked the phone back up and reread the message again, my heart shrinking with every line. Charlotte's words were carefully written, full of concern, disapproval, and distance. She made sure to say that she had no idea, that Tyler had framed the situation as minor, exaggerated. She even said she was disgusted by how he'd handled it, that she no longer wanted him in her life. It would have meant something if it hadn't come after the fact, after the damage. She'd been part of the problem, and now she wanted to wash her hands clean. "I don't care what she thinks," I muttered, dropping the phone into the drawer. "She's not the one I married." David gave a humorless laugh, nodding in agreement. "Still, we keep the receipts," he said, tapping the drawer with one knuckle. "Just in case." I didn't ask what for. By Wednesday, I'd contacted an attorney. It wasn't a decision made in anger. It was made in clarity. Every time I thought about Tyler sitting there calmly eating salmon while I bled in a hospital bed, my resolve hardened. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to be done. The attorney, Melissa Dwyer, had kind eyes and a sharp voice that made me feel like I'd brought a sword to a knife fight. She read over my notes quietly, only stopping once to ask if I had screenshots of the messages. I nodded and slid my phone across the desk. Her face didn't change as she read them, but her hand tightened around the pen. "We can work with this," she said. Divorce had always felt like a last resort, a word you whispered behind closed doors. Now it felt like fresh air after years in a room without windows. Melissa asked if I wanted to pursue anything beyond separation. Spousal support, shared property, claims. I shook my head. "I just want to walk away whole," I said. David drove me home afterward, his music low and his hands steady on the wheel. I stared ahead, exhausted but determined, feeling like a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. "You sure you don't want anything from him?" David asked as we pulled up to his apartment. I hesitated, then shook my head. He's already taken too much. I'm not giving him the chance to take more. Friday morning, a courier delivered the formal divorce notice to the townhouse, requiring only Tyler's signature and return envelope. I'd chosen to have it delivered while I was safely tucked into David's apartment, unwilling to be near him when the truth arrived in a legal packet. Melissa had said it would be cleaner this way. Fast, direct, no room for interpretation. He'd either sign and move on or drag it into a war he'd already lost. I expected silence or deflection, but instead, I got an email at 3:11 p.m. subject line. "We need to talk. Please don't do this." It was 3 paragraphs of self-pity disguised as reflection. Tyler claimed he'd been in shock, that Charlotte's emergency had made it difficult to process my accident properly. He didn't apologize for the lunch or the Uber text. He apologized for how I felt about them. I deleted it without responding, then added his address to my email filter, straight to trash. David cooked dinner that night. His version of comfort food was chicken enchiladas and spicy black beans, and it was better than anything Tyler ever made. He poured wine into mismatched mugs and said, "To clarity." Before raising his in the air, I clinked mine against his, smiling despite everything. It wasn't just the good food or the clean space. It was the peace that followed me into the night. For the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming of flashing lights or sirens. Over the weekend, Melissa's office emailed me a checklist for financial disclosures and asset division. I worked through it slowly, digging through old files I had brought from the townhouse, uncovering receipts and bank statements I hadn't reviewed in years. Tyler had spent far more than I realized. Golf clubs, restaurant bills, hotel room upgrades, all under the guise of client meetings or networking. The Sterling room alone had over $4,000 in charges across 6 months. He was eating steak and sea bass on Thursday afternoons while I skipped lunch to finish inventory reports. David leaned over my shoulder as I scrolled through the statements. "He's going to regret this in about 2 months," he said, voice flat, "when the reality sets in that no one's covering his lifestyle anymore." I nodded, too tired to feel spiteful. "Let him miss me," I murmured. "I'm already done missing him." On Tuesday, I got a call from Riverside General's HR department. My supervisor, Margaret, had recommended me for a temporary lead position while she recovered from surgery, and they needed someone to step up quickly. I hesitated, unsure if I could manage the pressure so soon after everything, but something in me stirred, a small, fierce voice that said I was more than what Tyler left behind. "I'll do it," I told them. "Thank you for thinking of me." David surprised me that night with a new bookshelf for the spare room, even though I hadn't asked for one. "You've got all those books stacked like Jenga," he said, shrugging as he carried it in. "Figured you deserve shelves that won't collapse on your foot." It was dark wood, simple and sturdy, nothing flashy, just functional and kind. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling something close to home in its quiet presence. The next morning, the doorbell rang, and I found a small package on the doormat with no return address. Inside was my wedding ring. No note, no explanation, just the ring nestled in a velvet pouch like it meant nothing. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of 8 years pressing into my palm. Then I placed it in a box labeled "To Donate" and moved on. Some symbols only hold power if you let them. That Thursday, I received a text from Charlotte's number. "I've blocked him. I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. Please take care of yourself." The irony nearly made me laugh. Charlotte was moving on faster than Tyler ever would. For someone who had demanded all his attention, she sure disappeared when things stopped being convenient. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Charlotte could rewrite her role however she wanted. But I wasn't interested in edits to history. She'd gotten my husband's loyalty, such as it was, and he'd lost everything in the process. That was their mess now, not mine. A week later, the divorce packet returned, signed and sealed. Melissa called to confirm that it would be filed immediately, and the waiting period would begin. "You're officially in motion," she said, her voice warm but efficient. Most people feel a strange mix of relief and grief right about now. I looked out the window at the tree just beginning to bloom again and said, "Mostly relief." David came home that evening with Chinese takeout and 2 fortune cookies. "I figured we'd celebrate with lo mein and legal liberation," he joked, handing me the bag. We sat on the couch with our food balanced on mismatched plates and a rerun of Jeopardy in the background. When I cracked open my fortune cookie, the slip inside read, "The hard part is over. The real part is just beginning." I folded it in half and placed it in the jar by the bookshelf. By the end of the month, my shoulder ached less, the bruises faded, and the nightmares had stopped waking me up at 3 a.m. I found myself humming while doing the dishes, something I hadn't done in years without noticing. My reflection looked less hollow. My laugh came quicker, and when the final divorce documents arrived, stamped by the court, I didn't cry. I exhaled. Before I narrate what happens next, kindly let me know what city or country you're watching from and why you haven't subscribed yet. 2 days after the court finalized the divorce, I walked out of Riverside General with a bag of celebration pastries from the nurse's break room. Margaret had returned to work earlier that week, and the staff insisted on commemorating my temporary leadership with fruit tarts and a hastily scribbled card. I didn't tell them about the divorce. They already knew. Hospitals are small towns wrapped in scrub fabric and soap dispensers. The whispers had made their rounds long before the papers were signed. Melissa, one of the ER nurses, hugged me tightly as I tried to slip out unnoticed. "You look lighter," she said, stepping back with a smile that didn't require explanation. I nodded, unable to put the shift into words. It wasn't just that Tyler was gone. It was that I no longer had to wonder when I would be invisible again. That afternoon, David texted me a photo of the townhouse. The lights were off, the blinds drawn, and a rental sign had been staked into the lawn. "He moved out," the message said. "Guess it wasn't worth staying once you were gone." I stared at the photo for a long moment, unsure of what I felt. It didn't sting. It was just confirmation that the house had never been home, not without me. Later that evening, while rearranging the books on my new shelf, I found a small envelope tucked into one of the paperbacks I'd brought from the townhouse. Inside was a note Tyler had written during our 2nd anniversary, back when he still left me letters instead of silence. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but earnest. "You ground me, Hannah. I don't say it enough, but I couldn't do life without you." I folded the note and dropped it into the recycling bin without hesitation. He'd been right about one thing. I was the one keeping everything together. David came home a few minutes later, with a grocery bag in one hand and a grin on his face. "Hope you like strawberries," he said, setting them on the counter. "Figured we could celebrate freedom with something sweet that doesn't involve lawyers or liquor." I smiled, genuinely this time, and helped him slice the fruit with my good arm. Every motion felt like reclaiming space I didn't realize had been taken from me. That weekend, I drove past the intersection where the accident happened. It wasn't intentional. I'd taken a different route home and ended up there by instinct. The light turned green and I sat there for a moment. Not afraid, just reflective. The spot looked painfully ordinary. No skid marks, no memorial flowers, no sign that anything had changed. But it had. Back at David's apartment, I stood in the doorway of the spare room and realized how much of it now felt like mine. My books were alphabetized, my jacket hung neatly on the back of the chair, and my favorite candle flickered on the nightstand. It was temporary, but it was safe, and that was enough for now. David knocked softly and peeked in. "You hungry? Or should we pretend fruit counts as dinner?" We ended up ordering pizza and watching a terrible action movie where the hero kept making decisions that defied logic and physics. Somewhere between the exploding helicopters and bad one-liners, I started laughing, really laughing, the kind that shakes your shoulders and makes your eyes water. David just watched me for a second before joining in. "There's the sister I remember," he said. I hadn't realized how much I missed myself until I heard it aloud. The following week, I got an email from Riverside General offering to make my leadership position permanent. Margaret had decided to retire early, and the board agreed I was the right fit to take over the pharmacy full-time. It should have felt overwhelming, but it didn't. I'd been running that department behind the scenes for years while Tyler played savior to someone else. Now I'd finally get the title that matched the work I'd always done. I forwarded the offer to Melissa, my lawyer, just to be thorough, and her response came quickly. "Congratulations. Told you there was life after him." I smiled at the screen and typed back a simple thank you. The promotion wasn't about proving something to Tyler. It was about finally stepping into a role I'd earned. It was mine. Not because he left, but because I stayed standing. That Thursday, I walked into work early and brewed a fresh pot of coffee, letting the smell fill the pharmacy. I adjusted the new nameplate on my desk, Hannah Lewis, Farm D, Department Lead, and allowed myself one moment of quiet pride. The nurses drifted in throughout the morning, each one offering congratulations and stories about Margaret's retirement plans. By noon, I was buried in reports and supplier forms, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. When my shift ended, I didn't dread the evening. I stopped at the market for fresh bread and lavender tea, letting myself browse the aisles without rushing. No one was waiting at home to ask why dinner wasn't ready, or why I spent too much on organic produce. I was free to choose what I liked, what I wanted, without compromise. It was a small thing, but freedom lives in small things. Back at David's, I set the tea kettle on and let the steam fog the kitchen window. Outside, the sky had turned a soft pink, the kind of light that makes everything look gentle. I curled up on the couch with a novel and pulled a blanket over my lap. The air was quiet, warm, undemanding. For the first time in years, Thursday didn't feel like a countdown to disappointment. The next Thursday came and went without a single intrusive thought about Tyler or Charlotte. I worked my full shift, organized the new supply room layout, and left a note for the night pharmacist before locking up. As I walked to my car, a gust of spring wind caught the hem of my coat, and for a moment I just stood there breathing. No tears, no weight in my chest. When I got back to David's apartment, he was at the kitchen table, sorting through paperwork and muttering about clients who couldn't decide between quartz and granite countertops. "You look like someone who didn't think about salmon today," he said with a smirk. I laughed, setting my keys in the tray by the door. "Not a single overpriced lunch special crossed my mind," I replied. "And the Sterling Room can go bankrupt for all I care." David closed his folder and gestured for me to sit. "Got something for you," he said, sliding an envelope across the table. I opened it carefully, unsure what to expect, and found a small key taped inside. "It's yours," he said, "just in case you want to start looking for something permanent." I blinked, caught between surprise and gratitude. "You want me to leave?" I asked quietly, though I already knew better. David shook his head and reached for his coffee. "Nope, just want you to have options." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "You don't have to start over, but you get to if you want." That weekend, I toured 2 small apartments not far from the hospital. One was too cramped, the other too dark, but both made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Choice. I wasn't looking for perfect, I was looking for mine. And for the first time in years, the decision felt like it belonged entirely to me. On Monday, Melissa, the lawyer, not the nurse, sent over Tyler's final settlement paperwork. He wasn't contesting anything. No drawn-out arguments, no hidden assets, no manipulative delays, just clean signatures and a line at the bottom stating the marriage was dissolved by mutual agreement. It felt less like closure and more like confirmation. That night, I opened the drawer where I'd hidden the old wedding photo and finally shredded it. The sound was satisfying, the way it crackled and disappeared piece by piece. I didn't cry. I didn't second guess. The picture was a snapshot of who we'd pretended to be, not who we really were. At work, people stopped tiptoeing around me. The staff meetings became sharper, more focused, and I found myself contributing more than ever. My ideas weren't just heard, they were implemented. I wasn't just the one left behind anymore. I was the one moving forward. On Wednesday, a familiar face appeared at the pharmacy counter. It was Richard Wilson, Tyler's father, his expression weary and his gray suit wrinkled around the collar. He handed me a prescription slip and stood silently as I processed it. "I thought I'd run into you eventually," he said. I nodded, placing the label on the bottle with steady hands. "How are you holding up?" he asked, though he already looked like he knew the answer. I considered lying out of habit, but then I met his eyes. "Better," I said honestly. "A lot better, actually." He looked away, and something about the gesture felt like surrender. "I didn't raise him to be like that," Richard muttered almost to himself. "But I suppose that doesn't mean much now." I didn't respond. It wasn't my job to console the man who once told me at Thanksgiving that Tyler was just overwhelmed by responsibility. He took the bag with his medication and paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said. "I'm sorry he wasn't there." I nodded once, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. It was a small thing, late and useless, but honest. "Thank you," I replied, watching as he disappeared through the sliding doors. And just like that, the last tie to Tyler slipped quietly out of my life. Later that night, David surprised me with takeout from the new Thai place downtown. We sat on the couch eating pad see ew and drinking seltzer water like it was champagne. "Guess what?" he said between bites. "My company's hosting a charity gala next month. Strict dress code, stuffy donors, the works." I raised an eyebrow. "You inviting me to be your moral support?" "I'm inviting you to be the person everyone stares at because she glows under terrible ballroom lighting," he said, grinning. I rolled my eyes, but my smile betrayed me. "Only if I get to wear flats," I warned. "Deal," he said, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "To terrible lighting and better company." That weekend, I found a third apartment, sunlit, small, and on the top floor with a tiny balcony. I signed the lease the same day. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to begin, and this time I was building it for myself. Moving day came with a bright sky and a breeze that made the boxes feel lighter than they were. David helped carry the heavier ones, grumbling the whole time but with a smirk that gave him away. "Your new place smells like ambition and lavender," he joked, dropping a box labeled Books/Survival. I laughed, brushing hair from my face as I opened the balcony door. The sunlight spilled in like an old friend, warming the hardwood floors I now owned with pride. By noon, everything was inside, if not in the right place. The couch was a hand-me-down from David's guest room, the dishes mismatched, and my bed frame still leaned against the wall, but it already felt like mine. I hung up a framed print that read, "You are allowed to change," above the kitchen sink. The words felt like a benediction, a truth I hadn't believed for far too long. This wasn't just a space. It was a declaration. David left after lunch, promising to return with pizza and a hammer for the bed frame. I spent the afternoon slowly unpacking, savoring each drawer I filled, each cabinet I claimed. There were no arguments about shelf space, no sideways glances when I played music while folding towels. My playlist filled the rooms without being interrupted by passive-aggressive sighs or Charlotte's text tones. It was peaceful in the way silence only is when it belongs to you. That evening, I stepped onto the balcony with a cup of tea and let the city hum around me. My view wasn't glamorous, just rooftops and telephone wires, but it felt real and alive. Below, a dog barked at nothing, and someone played guitar 2 buildings over, off-key but earnest. I sat on a second-hand cushion and curled my feet beneath me, feeling something settle deep inside. This was mine. The following week at work, everything accelerated. A major inventory audit came up short, and I stayed late 3 nights in a row resolving it. Melissa the nurse brought me a donut on Friday and said, "You're becoming the glue here, you know that?" I smiled through a yawn and replied, "Glue doesn't sleep much." But I didn't mind. It felt good to be needed for something that mattered. After the audit wrapped, the hospital director sent me a thank you email and included me in the department head's quarterly meeting. For the first time, I walked into that boardroom not as someone's wife or the woman covering extra shifts, but as the person in charge. Tyler's absence wasn't noticeable here. He'd never stepped foot into this part of my world. My promotion wasn't about filling space he left behind. It was about expanding into the space I had earned. On Thursday morning, I passed the Sterling Room on my way to a supplier breakfast. I didn't mean to look inside, but I did. The window seat, the one Tyler and Charlotte always reserved, was empty. A new couple sat there now, their heads bowed over menus, lost in polite conversation. Whatever history lingered in that spot had moved on without me. That same day, I received an Instagram message from Charlotte. I hadn't blocked her, mostly because I wanted the option of reading what she'd say if she ever reached out again. The message was short. "I left the city. I hope you're doing better. I never should have let it get that far." There was no apology, but for once, I didn't feel the need for one. She was gone, and her silence was now mine to keep. Saturday morning, I met David for brunch at a tiny cafe near my new place. He raised an eyebrow when I ordered a mimosa and said, "Look at you. day drinking like someone who finally stopped apologizing. I grinned and sipped slowly, letting the citrus and champagne settle behind my ribs. "I realized something," I told him, setting my glass down. Tyler only knew how to love people who needed rescuing. David didn't interrupt, letting me finish the thought. When I stopped needing to be rescued, he didn't know what to do with me anymore. I said, so he looked for someone who always played the victim. My brother nodded, his face softening. "And now, you're the hero of your own story." After brunch, I stopped at the local bookstore and picked up a hardcover I'd been eyeing for weeks. No guilt, no hiding the receipt, no justifying the expense. Just a book I wanted, bought for no one's approval but my own. Back home, I read it in one sitting, sprawled across my too small couch with the window open to let the breeze in. That night, I lit a candle on the windowsill and wrote a list of everything I wanted to do by the end of the year. It wasn't long, just 6 things, but they all belonged to me. Learn to cook something without a microwave, visit a new city alone, dance at someone else's wedding and mean it. It was a list built on want, not obligation, hope, not healing. The next week at work, Richard Wilson showed up again. This time he didn't need a prescription, just a moment. "I heard about your promotion," he said, standing stiffly at the counter. "Tyler knows, too." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting him fill the silence. "He's not doing well," Richard admitted. "He's not the same since everything." I didn't ask for details. Whatever Tyler's unraveling looked like, it wasn't mine to witness. "Sometimes you don't get to see the consequences," I said, scanning in a delivery behind the counter. "Sometimes you just get to walk away from them." Richard looked like he wanted to say something more, but he didn't. Instead, he gave a small nod and walked away, shoulders hunched in the weight of someone else's choices. I didn't feel vindicated, just released. His pain wasn't mine. His regret didn't belong to me. That Thursday evening, I walked home beneath a sky streaked with gold, the light catching on shop windows and bicycle spokes. The air smelled like rain and baked bread, and someone's wind chimes sang from a second-floor balcony. I paused before unlocking my door, watching the neighborhood wind down for the day. Kids raced past on scooters. A dog barked joyfully at nothing. Inside, my apartment welcomed me with soft lamplight and quiet. I set my bag down, slipped off my shoes, and turned on music that made me sway without realizing it. No one called to ask why dinner wasn't ready. No messages buzzed with crises that weren't mine to fix. Just me, here, whole, and finally free. A month passed, and the rhythms of my new life solidified, like well-set concrete. I learned that I liked grocery shopping at 9 p.m. when the store was quiet and everything smelled like disinfectant and possibility. I discovered that lavender linen spray helped me sleep better and that I preferred decaf after 4 p.m. A fact Tyler always mocked, claiming it was pointless coffee. No one laughed when I confessed these preferences now. In fact, there was no one to ask permission from, which made every choice feel like a tiny revolution. At the hospital, I implemented a new training schedule that cut onboarding time by 2 weeks. The board noticed, and during our monthly meeting, they praised the changes with a kind of reverence that made my ears burn. I didn't deflect like I used to. I said thank you and meant it. Melissa, the nurse, whispered after the meeting, "You're glowing again," and this time I didn't brush it off. I was glowing, not because I'd found someone new, but because I'd finally found myself. One Thursday, while walking past the city courthouse on my lunch break, I saw Tyler. He was seated on the steps, hunched over, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. I froze for a second, instinct kicking in before logic caught up. He didn't see me. He looked smaller than I remembered, like a man slowly learning that charm doesn't pay rent when no one's playing along. I stood there, only long enough to feel nothing. No anger, no sadness, not even vindication. Just a strange, quiet awareness that our timelines had officially split. I walked on, my heels clicking steadily over concrete like punctuation marks at the end of a chapter. That weekend, I hosted a dinner party in my apartment. Just 6 people, David, Melissa from work, my neighbor from across the hall, and her sister visiting from out of town. Everyone brought something, and we passed mismatched plates around while David attempted to make sangria in a mixing bowl meant for salad. We laughed until the neighbors knocked to tell us they wished they were invited too. No one talked about exes. No one mentioned Charlotte. I glanced around the room mid-laugh and realized I didn't miss who I had been back then. I missed the idea of being loved, but not the reality of being tolerated. Tyler had loved the version of me that needed him, and when I stopped needing him, he didn't recognize me anymore. These people knew the new version, the one I'd grown into after everything, and they liked her. More importantly, I liked her too. The next morning, I walked to the corner cafe and ordered an almond croissant and a chai latte, savoring the way the barista remembered my name without me ever needing to say it twice. Outside, I passed Mrs. Chin, my old neighbor from the townhouse days. She beamed when she saw me, her arms full of tulips from the Saturday market. "You look wonderful, dear," she said, patting my hand. "Divorce suits you." We both laughed, and I promised to visit her garden soon. As I walked away, I thought about how surreal it felt to be seen as someone thriving. 6 months ago, I was bleeding in a car, trying to type with one hand while the other hung limp and broken. Now I was being complimented by strangers on the street. Healing isn't linear, but sometimes it's measurable in croissants and garden visits. By mid-April, the hospital invited me to speak at a panel on leadership for women in medicine. I almost declined, unsure if I had anything to offer beyond my story. But Melissa, always blunt, said, "You survived a marriage, an accident, and a betrayal. You've got more to say than half the people they'll put on that stage." So I said yes, and then I bought a navy dress that made me feel like steel wrapped in silk. On the night of the panel, I stood backstage with my note cards clenched in my good hand. My shoulder had fully healed, though on rainy days it still ached just enough to remind me I was human. The scar near my temple was nearly invisible now, but I didn't cover it with makeup. It was part of the story, part of the truth I had earned. When they called my name, I stepped into the light and told the room how survival becomes strength when you stop apologizing for being the one who lived. Afterward, someone from HR approached me about mentoring new hires. "You've got something they need," she said. "Resilience and reality." I accepted the offer and thought about how far I'd come from being the woman who used to cry in the break room because Charlotte had texted again. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a beginning. That Sunday, David came over for dinner, this time bringing dessert instead of furniture. We sat on the balcony, sharing slices of chocolate torte and trading stories about our parents' worst vacations. "You know," he said, licking frosting from his fork. "I think you've done it." I raised an eyebrow. "Done what?" "Turn the worst day of your life into the best thing that ever happened to you," he said. I stared at him, fork halfway to my mouth, then set it down slowly. "It's not that simple," I replied. "It still hurt. It still hurts sometimes." David nodded, not correcting me, not pushing the narrative into a silver lining. "I know," he said, "but that's what makes it real. You're not pretending to be okay. You actually are." We clinked glasses, mine filled with seltzer, his with cheap red wine, and let the city settle around us like a soft blanket. The sky turned dusky blue, and somewhere below, wind chimes caught a breeze. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about Tyler. I just watched the light fade and felt whole. May arrived, with lilacs blooming along the sidewalks and early morning light that made everything feel like a promise. I started walking to work again, the 15-minute route winding past small bakeries, sleepy bookstores, and a mural that seemed to grow more vibrant every week. People nodded good morning as I passed, and I nodded back, grateful for the anonymity of a life that finally fit me. The apartment felt more like home now, every room layered with pieces of me. Soft rugs, photos I actually liked, mugs that didn't match but made me smile. Nothing was curated for appearances. It was designed for comfort. On one particularly clear morning, I stopped at the pharmacy's glass doors and saw my reflection staring back at me. Hair windblown, blazer slightly wrinkled, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. I looked like someone solid, someone who'd walked through fire and didn't smell like smoke anymore. I didn't fix my hair or adjust my sleeves. I just opened the door and walked into my life. Later that week, Melissa, my lawyer this time, called to let me know Tyler had officially filed a change of address. He'd left the state. "No forwarding details, just a P.O. box in Oregon," she said, sounding slightly amused. I didn't ask for more. It wasn't my job to keep tabs on ghosts. I hung up and went back to prepping medication reports for the monthly audit, not once thinking about where he was or who he might be with. It didn't matter anymore. Tyler existed in the past, like an outdated prescription, once necessary, now irrelevant, and not worth refilling. There was freedom in that disinterest, a kind of peace that didn't demand explanation. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's just a quiet door you don't reopen. The weekend of the charity gala arrived, and David insisted I wear the dress again, the navy one from the panel. "You look like you could command a room in that thing," he said as he picked me up in a borrowed black sedan. He was right. I walked into the ballroom and didn't shrink beneath the chandeliers or the wealth or the whispers. I belonged, not because someone brought me, but because I brought myself. As the evening unfolded, I sipped ginger ale from a champagne flute and danced once with an architect who complimented my posture and asked for my opinion on universal healthcare. He didn't ask if I was married or if I planned to be. He didn't touch my waist without permission or try to explain my job back to me. When the song ended, I thanked him, stepped away, and joined David at the dessert table. "I liked that," I said, "but I still like being alone more." That night, back in my apartment, I kicked off my shoes, set the navy dress over the arm of the chair, and stood by the window for a while. The city buzzed gently in the distance, a soft lullaby of car horns and life. I poured a glass of water and opened a new journal I'd bought the week before, this one with a deep green cover and gold-edged pages. On the first page, I wrote, "I'm not starting over. I'm continuing, and I get to decide what comes next." The following Thursday was the 6-month mark. 6 months since the accident. 6 months since the Sterling room, the message, the silence. 6 months since the ambulance ride that rewrote everything. I didn't plan anything elaborate, but when David texted, "Thinking of you, come over for tacos?" I replied, "Only if you let me bring dessert." We ate in his kitchen like we always did, with music in the background, and mismatched plates and casual conversation. Somewhere between tacos and laughter, he paused and said, "You know what I'm proudest of?" I raised an eyebrow. "Waiting. That you never let his absence define your worth," he said. I swallowed around the lump in my throat and nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Later, I walked home under a dusky sky, my heels clicking a slow, steady rhythm against the sidewalk. A teenager on a skateboard zoomed past me, yelling something joyful to a friend, and I smiled. The intersection at Madison and 5th was up ahead, the one I'd been avoiding for 6 months without realizing. I paused at the corner and waited for the light to change. When it did, I stepped forward without fear. There were no flashbacks, no tears, no heart-pounding dread, just a sense of quiet acknowledgement. This is where it happened. This is where I changed. Not because of what someone else did, but because of how I decided to respond. I crossed the street like it owed me nothing and arrived on the other side like I'd always belonged there. The summer crept in slowly, days stretching longer, windows left open at night, and books piling up beside my bed. I planted herbs on my balcony and found joy in watching mint grow aggressively in the sun. Sometimes I caught myself humming while folding laundry or dancing barefoot in the kitchen while stirring pasta. It was nothing extraordinary, and that was what made it beautiful. Peace doesn't always arrive with trumpets. It sometimes just sits on your couch and asks what's for dinner. One day in July, a coworker asked if I ever planned to date again. I laughed and said maybe. The truth was, I wasn't in a hurry. I liked my own company now. I liked my life, unshared, unfiltered, completely mine. By August, I'd booked a solo trip to Vancouver. A long weekend. Just me, a suitcase, and a hotel near the coast. When I told David, he clapped like a proud parent and offered to drive me to the airport. "Only if you promise not to cry when I leave," I joked. "I'll try not to embarrass you in front of customs," he said, giving me a dramatic salute. On the flight, I watched clouds pass and felt no anxiety, no guilt, no pressure to perform for anyone. I didn't need to make sure someone else was comfortable first. For once, I was flying without carrying anyone else's baggage. In Vancouver, I walked through markets, drank too much coffee, and spent hours in bookstores. One afternoon, I sat on a bench near the harbor with a journal in my lap and the sun on my shoulders. I thought about the accident, about the Thursday lunches, the Uber message, the Sterling room, The police walking through glass doors while Tyler smiled over wine. I thought about what it meant to be chosen, or not, and then I stopped thinking about it altogether, because that was the real healing. Not forgiving him, not confronting him, just forgetting to think about him entirely. That's how I knew I'd won. I flew home with a tan, 3 new books, and a magnet for David's fridge that said, "Keep going, no one's coming." It made us both laugh more than it should have. And then one evening, weeks later, I stood on my balcony watching the sky dim and realized I didn't need to tell this story anymore. It had been mine for long enough. Now it was just something that happened before the good parts started. Thank you for listening to Hannah's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.